Hello, I'm Andrew Corbett and welcome to the background footage for the Dear Timothy Small Group Bible Study Series. The study series is entitled Dear Timothy, a father's final words to his son Timothy. This is based on study number 6, How to Behave in the Household of God. In this passage, based on 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verses 14, 15, 16 to the end of chapter 3, and then all of chapter 4, we're looking at how to behave in the household of God. Paul is addressing the two problems that plagued the church at Ephesus. This was the problem emerging from a group called the Gnostics. It's got a silent G in English. In Greek, where this word comes from, gnosis, you'll hear that I said gnosis. The G is not silent. In fact, in Greek, there's rarely, if any, silent letters. The Gnostics, from the word knowledge, gnosis, believed that salvation was something to do with Jesus because he was an enlightened one who had a certain special knowledge of what it meant to be saved. This special knowledge, the Gnostics claimed, could be attained if you separated from worldly pleasures, if you separated from the material world. The material world was basically evil. It's one of the reasons why the New Testament writers, when confronting the early signs of this heresy, they stress that Jesus Christ came in the flesh. Because the Gnostics were teaching that since the world, the material world, the flesh was evil, Jesus the Christ could not have been in the flesh. It was just an illusion. As God's Son, there's no way he would have condescended to take on human flesh. But the writers of the New Testament, and in this particular passage particularly, Paul stresses that Jesus Christ was indeed a human, a man, a person, someone who took on human flesh. In fact, to make his point, he does something particularly interesting. Rather than quote the Old Testament prophets, rather than cite a fellow apostle, rather than take even some of the words of Jesus himself or some of the life examples of Christ himself, which he could have done. He could have referred to the moment when Jesus, after his resurrection, took fish with the disciples and ate it with them. Or immediately after the resurrection, when he appeared to the disciples as they gathered together, huddled together, and he asked them, does anyone have any food? And he ate food. A ghost, a non-corporeal, a spirit without a body doesn't eat food. Paul could have done that, but he didn't. Instead, the interesting thing that he does is he cites an ancient Christian hymn. A hymn in verse 16 that says, he was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels. That first line of the opening of this hymn, the opening line of this hymn, combats immediately the heresy of this early Gnostic push upon that church at Ephesus. We see also that the second heresy that was really plaguing the church at Ephesus was Jesus enough? The other heresy was promoted by a group called the Judaizers. We meet them fairly early on in the book of Acts, and we find that Paul's epistle, particularly to the Galatians, addresses the heresy that they were promoting. And their heresy was essentially that you had to become a Jew first, then you could become a Christian. And the Judaizers were saying this is what Gentiles, that is ethnically non-Jewish people, had to go through in order to become a Christian. Paul is going to use an expression, and he uses it in his epistle to the Ephesians, that completely discounts this heresy of the Judaizers. It's the expression, the household of God. In Ephesians 2:19, he describes the church as the household of God. And in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, he says this, "If I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth." Now this is particularly interesting because this passage is telling the believers in Ephesus, where Timothy is as Paul's representative in Ephesus. And Paul is saying in this statement that the church is not like the culture around it. The church is a pillar and an upholder of the truth. And what's the truth? Well, that's where he goes on in this hymn to state the core truth of Christianity. It's about Jesus Christ, who he is, and his unique and exclusive work. No one else has been able to do what Jesus Christ did, and no one else can. Paul says he was proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory. He was vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, he says. So the work of Christ in his atoning work, that is, when he died on the cross, that very first Easter, was enough for anyone who puts their faith or belief in him, as he says, citing this hymn, that they would be saved. They could come to know peace with God and eternal life. So in this one stanza of an ancient Christian hymn, Paul has dealt with two heresies that were besetting the Ephesian church. The interesting expression, the household of God, was based on the Greco-Roman concept of a household. A householder, the one whose house he was responsible for, and usually it was a he. In some instances, as we see in Acts chapter 16, it was a woman as well. But the householder provided some security, provision, protection, and identity for those members of the household. So if someone was a part of the household, whether they be the householder's wife, the householder's parents or parents-in-law, or unmarried sisters-in-law, or his sisters and his children, and perhaps servants or slaves, these people had identity. They had security. They were known as the household of, named the householder. We see Paul refer to different householders in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where he refers to the household of Stephanus. And so the householder was someone in a community of means, someone who could provide for their household. A small household would have been around 20 to 30 people or so, but a larger household could have been upwards of over 100 people. In fact, there's records of householders having at minimum 200 slaves and more, plus their family. So the householder had a dwelling that could accommodate that many people, usually a courtyard, usually with some kind of water source, a fountain or a pool, a small pool of sorts. And when we read in Acts chapter 16 that Paul went to the jailer's household, when he told that jailer, "You and your household shall be saved," they were able to go to his household dwelling and baptize everyone. And so the household, the Greco-Roman household, the architecture, the building, was a sizable place. In fact, you can see the ingeniousness of the disciples, the apostles, when they were sent out into the Greco-Roman world to plant churches, that they would particularly seek to evangelize a householder. Because by evangelizing the householder, by leading that householder to Christ, they had almost a ready-made church with an existing structure already in place. So many of the original elders of the earliest church were actually householders. As we come into chapter 4, we see that Paul is addressing particularly the errors of the Gnostics. And he calls out that some of these Gnostics, they're not really genuine. In other words, they're liars. They're just simply dressing up so-called spiritual talk to manipulate people. And we see as we go through 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy that some of the most vulnerable of those people were wealthy young widows. These wealthy young widows were susceptible to the false teaching of these Gnostic, heretical preachers. It seems as if they used Christian language. They spoke about Jesus, they spoke about the Bible, they spoke about prophets, they spoke about these things, but yet they put a Gnostic twist to it, which we read in Colossians included things like don't eat certain foods, don't partake in certain physical activities, don't, and there's all these rules that they have, keep certain days and so on. And here Paul confronts these. He confronts them in 1 Timothy chapter 4, and he says to Timothy, you will be a good minister. Greek word diakonos. We use it in English in the word deacon. A deacon is a servant. So a minister, that's another word for servant. Someone who is prepared to serve, someone who is prepared to do whatever to help others. And Paul says that as a good preacher, as a good diakonos, you need to teach people the truth. But here's what Paul also says. There's a few things, in fact there's 4 really powerful things that Paul says to Timothy in order for him to become a good pastor. And those 4 things are actually a model for anyone, any pastor who would seek to be a biblical pastor, someone who can care for people and disciple people into the image and likeness of Christ, and to be able to give them the life skills to be able to deal with the difficulties that inevitably come their way. The first one he mentions in verse 11, chapter 4, verse 11, that the biblical pastor is someone who has confident authority. They're confident in God's word, and they are able to declare it with great authority. This is what God says. This is what his word says. Confident authority. The second one we see in verse 12 is that they were to have Christ-like authenticity. They were to be able to set an example, Paul says. And this is what he tells Timothy. The third one is that he's telling Timothy, you must preach and you must teach the word. And that is consistent acclamation. And then we see that Paul actually tells Timothy, remember the gift that you received when the elders came around you, laid their hands on you, and prayed for you? Paul says Timothy's received a gift. Focus on that gift, he tells him. The word gift in the New Testament, it comes from the word grace, charis. And we have in English the word charismatic, which are those people, that group of Christianity that believes in the spiritual gifts. Paul is telling Timothy to give attention to the charismatic gift that he's received, that gift of grace that God has given him, and focus on that. You can't be all things to all people. And pastors, you can't either. God's given you a gift, use that gift, and God will gather people around you who can meet that lack. And that should help pastors to realise that oftentimes the expectations that people have for them to be able to care and for their every need, to be attentive to their every need, to even know what their needs are without them even telling the pastor, these are unreasonable expectations on a pastor. Little wonder then, there are many, many pastors who feel the weight of that expectation, particularly young pastors, and it's too much. The dropout rate in Australia is around about 50% of pastors within about 5 years or so of being in ministry. It's alarmingly high. For those who want to be a biblical pastor, there has to be a conviction that these things that Paul is telling Timothy in what is generally called pastoral epistles are also applicable for us as pastors today. By doing this, the pastor and those he or she leads will have a reasonable expectation of what God expects within the household of God. And the whole point here is that how to behave in the household of God is not limited to that 1.5 hours or so on a Sunday morning. You are the household of God on a Monday morning. When you go to work, when you go to school, when you go to intersect with people in your daily life, you are representing the household of God. As you study this, I trust that the conversation will flow, and I trust that as you look at the application questions in particular, it will provoke you, stir you, and encourage you to consider your role in the household of God.